today's video is going to be palettes I don't like the look of, so I thought, seeing as I did a video on palettes that I like the look of, I would do a video on palettes that I don't like the look of. So let's just get into it. First is the Maybelline Blush Nude. The colours look so washed out, I just don't like the colour story. Don't like the packaging, it's just not my thing. Like, I really didn't like it. Next is the Naked 3. It's of its time, I find it boring. There are better neutral palettes. It's like, generally like just a cool toned neutral palette. Better ones, way too many shimmers. Really needed to work on the ratio of mattes to shimmers, and it just was very samey. Next is the Anastasia Beverly Hills Primrose palette. Boring, not a very inventive colour story. When you think of Primrose, you don't just think of boring neutral. You think of like pinks and shimmers and purples and lilacs and shades kind of similar to this palette, I would say, was kind of what you expect to sort of see in a Primrose, and also like pink as well, like pretty pinks and all of that. But also the packaging's bland. It's just a bland palette. There's so much they could have done with this palette. Like, it didn't need to be boring and bland. Next is the Urban Decay Reloaded palette. Other than a pop of pink, it's so boring. Essentially neutrals with a pop of pink. Like, that pink shade is the only interesting shade there is. Like, they're all just such boring shades. It's a boring colour story. I don't like it. Next is the Makeup Revolution Simpsons. Just another rainbow palette, not really Simpsons colours. It's like they just slapped the Simpsons on the palette, on the packaging. Didn't think of the colour story, didn't make it a colour story that you'd think, yeah, this is the Simpsons. It was just bad. Next is the Colourpop Harry Potter collection. Too many colours, should have just been Harry Potter colours and that's it. The neutrals were very repetitive. It just looked like every other eyeshadow palette. Next is the Too Faced Born This Way Nudes palette. I find this palette boring. I feel like there's better neutral palettes. It looks like every other Too Faced palette. There's better palettes than toothpaste. Like, just like every palette that's neutral, but probably with like a worse formula. Like, I don't like the Too Faced formula. Next is the NARS Climax eyeshadow palette. Dull colour story. The colours are so muted. Looking at the colour story, it just doesn't excite me. The packaging stands out more than the eyeshadow palette. Next is the MAC X9 Amber palette. I find this colour story so boring. Like, the colour story is so repetitive. It's like multiples of the same shades. It's just so basic, boring, bland, repetitive. Not my colour story. Next is the Sigma Ambience palette. A lot of the neutrals are quite dark. There's some very repetitive shimmer shades. I don't think it's my colour story. It's not my neutral cup of tea. Like, my favourite neutral palette is probably like something like this. Colour Story is a good neutral palette, I find. It's more my thing. Admittedly, there are pops of pink, but like, it just suits a lot better having that pop of pink. There's some orange. There's just better shades out there than these. It's just not my colour story, other than like the gold in the corner. Like, I've got so many other palettes I prefer to this. Next is the Urban Decay Naked Heat Petite. I just don't like this palette. Not the best colours from the Naked palette, from like the Naked Heat. Like, they didn't pick the best colours from this. Like, there's sort of, it's all the kind of just very muted ones. Like there's 3 really muted ones. It's one really dark one that's just a normal brown, and there's one orange. Like I would have put all of the best shades from the Naked Heat into this palette. Like it is just such a boring palette. I don't like this one. I prefer the Naked Heat over the Naked Heat Petite. I just find Store is just boring. Like there's 2 very similar shades. There's one that's quite similar. Like there's at least 2 that could have been switched for something better. Like they're just not the greatest. Next is the Urban Decay She-Hulk palette. There's only 1 green and that's it. Like there's no other greens. They're all quite muted other than the green and the blue. Like the other shades just get lost. It's like neutrals and pinks, and it's like when you think of She-Hulk you think of green. There's literally 1 green. Like they just should have made it an all green palette. Just rather boring. Next is the Too Faced Better Than Chocolate palette. We've moved past the chocolate bar palette. Like we've moved past that. Like that was so 2016. It's nothing innovative. It's like recycling an old idea. It has a rogue green shade that just doesn't fit with the palette. It just doesn't. Just seems like they've recycled an idea. Like they just do multiple versions of the chocolate bar palette, and we're past that by now. Like makeup has evolved from the chocolate bar palette of 2016. Next is the Natasha Denona Glam palette. Not the best neutral palette. Some of the colours are very repetitive. Not much colour variety. They look samey, muted. The packaging's boring. Just not the best Natasha Denona palette I've seen. Like I've seen a lot better ones. Like it's just so boring. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you in another video. Bye.